Why would anyone, especially an African-American man, use the symbolism of a noose to make false accusations?
Jussie Smollett's character has been written out of the last 2 episodes of the Fox show Empire. This after he was, of course, arrested and charged with staging a racial attack against himself, claiming that 2 Trump supporters assaulted him on a Chicago street. Some journalists took Smollett's original account as fact and linked it to President Trump before his story began to crumble. Washington Post global opinion editor Karen Ataya, regarding the heinous attack on Jussie Smollett, yet another reminder that Trump's ascendance and the resulting climate of hate has meant that lives have been increasingly at stake since 2015. Actress Ellen Page said we could connect the dots from Trump and Mike Pence to the purportedly homophobic attack.
What just happened to Jussie Smollett is a hate crime. It's absurd. This isn't a debate.
I agree.
Even when Smollett was charged with an outrageous hoax, his supporters were rather restrained in their remarks.
And if Jussie's story isn't true, he squandered the goodwill of a whole lot of people. He even lied to a lot of people, if it's not true, including me. And that's not cool.
And we're back with the panel. Molly Hemingway, did some in the media embrace this far-fetched narrative and kind of promote it, as we saw, because it fit the notion of pro-Trump thugs roaming the streets looking for a prominent gay black man to beat up?
Well, of course. And I do think it's important to remember that the local media actually did a fantastic job on this story. They broke details. They immediately kind of understood that this wasn't something you should just accept out of whole cloth. At the same time, the national media did a very bad job. I'm actually kind of happy to see some of what was just shown, because it shows that for them it was about the narrative. It was about being able to say that people who voted for Trump are bad people. What's important is, now that everyone realizes what they probably should have realized right at the outset, they need to make sure that they understand the harm that was done to Trump voters, that there are victims of fake hate crimes, and the group that he said committed this, which didn't commit this, deserves apologies, not just from the person who lied about them, but the people writing about it,
and
too.
a complete waste of police resources in Chicago. So, Richard, we just saw CNN's Don Lemon, who says he privately called Smollett every day to see if he was all right, and then he said, there was nothing, I didn't say anything about the veracity of the story because that's not my concern. So, and then he said, well, now that it's been exposed, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity will eat Smollett for lunch. Why are Smollett's supporters reluctant to harshly criticize him even now?
And the reason why Smollett's supporters are having a tough time criticizing him is because of this. Each and every day, LGBTQ folks, especially those of color, there's actual hate crimes really happening. I could name actual friends who have been victims of these type of crimes.
And nobody is disputing that.
No, nobody's disputing it.
But this hurts their cause. Doesn't it undermine the credibility of people who actually were attacked?
When you hear a crime like this, you, as part of the LGBTQ community, we have an obligation to defend and support our own, and so when that happens, it's very hard.
Defend and support your own without all the facts necessarily.
It's because a lot of times we're not believed. So what happens is you support your own, and so when this happens, it's heartbreaking when you find out that it was actually, if this is a hoax, and I think Jussie deserves due process, right? That it's heartbreaking to see that happen, because you know that every day, real people, trans women of color, there's one murdered every single day, and nobody's talking about it. It's not on the top of the headline. So when you see cases like this, we have an obligation to stand up for our community, and that's why people responded the way that they did.
Sarah, most journalists, including me, thought this smelled bad from the start. I in fact, turned down a chance to talk about this on Fox a couple weeks ago. I said, it's too murky. I don't know all the facts. But many news organizations attributed the allegations to Smollett, said the Chicago police were taking this seriously and investigating, and they also reported some of the red flags. Why didn't he call the cops immediately? Why did he hesitate to turn over his phone? Then he goes and repeats the charges on Good Morning America with Robin Roberts. So how do you not cover that? You cover it cautiously, but how do you not cover it?
I mean, it should be covered. It's a police investigation. I mean, it does have high-profile implications if it were true. But at the end of the day, as you said, media has to look at every single detail and hedge and provide enough information so that no one is going to rush to judgment. I also think, towards what you were saying, the media is not an activist. Journalists have to be unbiased here. And so even if you feel that a certain story isn't getting enough coverage or a certain population isn't being represented well, it's not necessarily your role to be calling someone every day involved in a story.
Right. On that point, another tweet was from a BuzzFeed writer named Kevin Fallon. He said, anyone who thinks supporting you-know-who, meaning Trump, who isn't tantamount to providing artillery for weaponized bigotry needs to take a hard look in the mirror, he later deleted and retracted that.
Right. There really is bigotry in these stories. This is the second fake news story related to MAGA hat wearers supposedly attacking people. This is the second fake one we've seen in a month. And the bigotry is that the media actually think really bad things about Trump voters, and they feel fine to say it about them, which is why their attacks on Trump, I think, are a lot of people hear them as attacks on them as people. And it's why he's able to get away with saying some of what he says against the media, because you see how the media feel about people who voted for Trump.
I want to push back on that just a little bit, because I think in the Jussie Smollett case in particular, Jussie's somebody who's been trusted in the community, somebody who's fought for the community. So when he came out and he talked about his allegations, especially after he sat down with Good Morning America's Robin Roberts, it seemed very clear that there's some truth to this. His passion, his conviction, how he displayed the facts. And then as we found out that some of these things might not be true, that's very hurtful. And so I think it's one thing to blame the journalist, but if you have a first account of what his narrative was, I think we have an obligation to believe him as a survivor. And I think when those facts didn't come out. I want
to push back on that, but first I want to remind people that he said that the two assailants, who turned out to be these two Nigerian brothers who he had hired and paid to stage the attack, according to police, were shouting, "This is MAGA country." You say we have an obligation, and you also talked about the prevalence of hate crimes in this country, to believe, not to report, but to believe somebody when they come out and say that. But isn't that going to lead to more and more of these incidents if the other people are making false claims? Why he deserves the presumption of legal innocence, but why should we automatically believe that claim?
Once again, like I said, I think Jussie's case is also an exception, not the norm, right? In the norm, there actually...
Well, I should certainly hope so.
Of course it is, and I think there's tons and tons of cases where there's LGBTQ people of color who are assaulted, and there are hate crimes done upon them by people of different races. But I think what we have to say here, and I think what's very important to understand here, is in this particular case, given the circumstances, given the parameters, given that we had the Chicago Police Department investigating it, after their record is also murky, after they covered the Laquan McDonald case, people were looking at this case and saying, there's a lot of reasons why you should believe Jussie, and the facts seem to work out.
There have been, though, dozens of attacks on people who are Trump voters that don't get this type of coverage. You know, you see them on video and they don't get this type of coverage. It is true that hate attacks happen all the time, but they happen against all people, and they need to be more evenly covered.
I agree, Molly, but there are dozens of attacks against gay people of color that aren't covered, like the fact that a mega DNC donor, Ed Bucks, killed two African Americans who were found dead in his home. He's still walking the earth as a free person.
We're just about out of time, but Sarah, the night that Smollett was charged, MSNBC's primetime shows didn't do anything at all. They hadn't covered the case that much. And I find that to be unbelievable. It was on a front-page story everywhere, and maybe they just didn't like the scenario.
I think the media has to respond to the media's coverage of this story, which is, look, we might have gone one way, we might have gone another. Here's what happened. We apologize if we didn't necessarily cover this from the get-go with all of the facts. And moving forward, we're going to do better. And I think to both of your points, I think that a lot of populations in the United States feel like their crimes are not being covered, but it's the media's role to do as best fact-checking as it can before making assumptions.
Apologize is a word you don't hear very often when it comes to the press. Richard Fowler, Sarah Fisher, Molly Hemingway, thanks so much for a great discussion.